Yay! Hallo Freunde, willkommen zurück zum .NET API Review. Es ist 10 Uhr in Redmond, minus, well, plus the 10 minutes that, we believe in being on time, which is that we don't. Yeah, we're going to see if we can get through half these red issues today. That'll be nice. Starting up, talking about again, expose the remaining const values in TimeSpan 904.545.
Yeah. Tanner, do you want to talk about it or do you want me to talk about it?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, I do not have a preference.
Okay. I can talk about it if you want me. Yeah. So this is get reviewed before. I was not in the first review, but that's all. That's fine. So basically about the original proposal is to have all constants proposed as long type. And it looks like last review, it get approved, but it suggested to change some constant to int type because the constant in the range of the int, as I understand. So while we are working, the guy from the community, was helping implementing that, and we got some feedback. Yeah, some of them is coming from Tanner, some is coming from the guy who is implementing it. It's kind of these constants are going to be used in the context of other operations that it can overflow the integers. So it can multiply it with other units or other values that it can overflow the integer range. And this potentially can make people run into problems without realizing it. So this is one thing. And second thing is all constants we have exposed before in the time span was from the long type. So currently I'm about exposing some as int, exposing some as long. Maybe there is some inconsistency, in the how we expose the constants there, but I want to understand about how hard about why we need to have all of them as or the proposed ones as int. If we can make it long, at least we'd be in safe side, avoiding to go through overflow operation and this stuff.
Right, so, the general thing of why they changed from int to long in the review is most of our consts are int. And there are a lot of operations, certainly in my opinion, where if you have a number of seconds that is usually less than 1,000, and you multiply it by milliseconds per second, and you're passing it to a function that has an int timeout ms, you're now really surprised that you have to cast that to int. Probably enough that you're just going to not use the constant, you're just going to write 1,000. And so, the hours per day, the minutes per hour, these are all, you're going to have small numbers that you're multiplying by this small number, and they're all going to fit with an int, and int is our norm. However, you point out that all the existing constants are long. I was going to say, but they're all big, except we have ticks per microsecond, which is the value 10. Exposes
That's
the long.
right.
So maybe here the answer is they should all be long, but to me this means they're all useless. I would never use them. The microseconds per whatever I would use, and I know it's going to be a long because I'm now dealing with microseconds, but everything else I would just hard code with the free floating number because I don't want to deal with longs.
How long are you? No, what's the problem with longs?
I'm probably working in ints, and so now I take an int times an int and have to now as a long, and I'm just going to hard cast it back to int, or I'm just going to write the constant, 86400 times 1,000. because 86400 is a number that I've typed for the 40 years I've been writing code. So
Yeah, so the main consideration on my end had been that in the context of time span, which is where a lot of these constants are frequently used, especially internally, we are explicitly working with long values. And it is more surprising to have an accidental overflow than it is to have a error saying you need to downcast this to int, which at least makes users think about, could it be too large? Now, the one exception to that is hours per day, where both hours and days for the maximum range that's representable in a time span are limited to int. And that's correspondingly why time span from days takes int days, and then the rest of them as and then the rest of the parameters as long. So I think the sensible thing for time span in the context of how time span works and the parameters that time span takes would be everything is long except for hours per day, which is int, simply because both domain of hours and days are within int max value.
I don't see why we have to special case hours per day even. Like, I think you're right that it probably doesn't bite you. I mean, you're going to be using this in much larger expressions that could lead to long values, but in those larger expressions, you probably have another thing that's a long, right? Like hours per day times like, you know, days per year times like milliseconds per hour, whatever. But
you can't represent days per year because that's not a constant value.
okay, right. Sorry. Yeah, no, like, yeah. I mean, obviously, the simplified programmer's year, where it's always 365 days. But yeah, no, I mean, obviously, and that's why we don't expose that. But like,
yeah,
this
so
already
specifically the
exists
consideration
as an int. Oh,
sorry,
it's an int even internally. Oh, okay. I was wondering, like, if this internally in our code was already a long, that would speak to me as a reason to keep it along. But the fact that it's internally an int right now makes me reconsider.
I don't recall
so the specific consideration.
Go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead, Tarek.
No, go ahead. Yes, that's fine.
Yeah. So the consideration specifically that I was talking about is that we have a public API today, public time span from days, and I posted it in chat here, where the way it takes it is int days, int hours, and then long minutes, seconds, milliseconds, microseconds. And that's specifically because days and hours can never be represented as a long. That is, the maximum number of days is 10.6 million and 256.2 million hours. It's only when you get to minutes that you hit 15 trillion minutes representable in a time span, and you are forced to start thinking in terms of long. And so that's why I was saying, if we were to fit with the existing time span usage and consistency, it would be everything is long except for hours per day, because that is the one place where both the from and the to fit within the constraint of int.max value.
Do you think this hours per day can be, I mean, like somebody doing some astronomical operations, which is like, you know, outside the range of time span? I mean,
you cut off in the middle there, Tarek, but
oh, sorry. I was just wondering about if hours per day can be used outside the context of time span. I mean, somebody using it for other calculations, that it might be outside the time span range, and at that time it can run outside this range that we are talking about.
That's definitely possible, but you have to be going many times outside the range of time span to hit that. Min and max days is 10.6 million days, and so you still have basically 2.14 billion I guess it's like 2.13 billion values, additional days you can go before you overflow into long. And so I think the most important consideration is these are constants on time span. They are expected to be used in the context of creating time spans, computing time span ticks, extracting information from time span. So what is the most correct thing to get users the right answer within time span itself?
Yeah, Tanner's won me over personally. Like at first I was like suspicious, like why this one particular const isn't in when everything else is long, but the justification makes sense to me.
Yeah, I'm fine with that.
Okay, so we're saying we're using long everywhere just because the type that it's on wants all these same units as long. Yes?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it makes it more obvious for things that might potentially overflow when within the size of the time span. Or what a time span can represent.
Yeah.
I think if we did want constants for use in cases like where we're taking int milliseconds, it might be useful to consider something like a time constants type that explicitly exposes them as int instead.
Right, because
But I think that's separate.
it's when you get, cancellation token source from a milliseconds, right? It takes an int. We have int milliseconds in a lot of places. And so when you're calling this one, I think people would think that they can pass, 3 times time span dot milliseconds per second. And then that'll be a compiler error.
Yeah, I totally get that.
So
yeah.
that's
and I totally get that.
okay.
I'm just more concerned about the fact that a user could type x times timespan dot milliseconds or seconds per millisecond or milliseconds per second rather, and have it silently overflow. And so I think that is enough to push us away from that, and that if we have this as a more desirable scenario, that we might want to consider addressing that with a separate type that specifically talks about in terms of the general abstraction for other common usages.
All right. So I think original was just long everything, but we're not going with that either. We're going with I don't hear pushback based on domain.
Would it be possible to skip to an issue of mine I need to drop for the next hour, unless there's any other priorities? Shouldn't be
Seems
very
fine to
long.
me.
Yeah, so it's a blocking issue in the list. Yes, JsonElement.valueSpan, that's the one. So if you click on the link at the top of the post, that should bring you to an API proposal. So effectively, that's a long requested issue from, primarily the Azure SDK team. They basically want a way to extract a non-allocating view of strings or numbers on a JSON element and correspondingly on a JSON property type. We haven't done it so far, but I actually implemented it internally for a recent JSON schema related feature, so I figured we might as well expose it for .NET 9. This more or less copies the design that you find in UTF-8 JSON Reader, so it exposes a value span property that just returns a read-only span of byte, and correspondingly exposes a value is escaped property that identifies whether the value has been, the string has been escaped per the JSON RFC.
What is
Correspondingly,
the safety of reading the value of this span? And I know that the answer is there isn't any. That's why we didn't expose this previously.
there isn't any, no.
Right. And our rule is if you expose a span, then it needs to be 100% clear to people when they can and can't rely on the data in it. And I do not believe anyone can rely on the data in this span.
We could expose it as a memory, if that helps.
The problem is the span is pointing to the array pool, and the data can be returned. It's not obvious when the data is returned, and now you're playing with somebody else's memory.
Yeah.
Like, this was very, very intentionally we will never add this on JsonElement when I wrote JsonElement. This was a never.
Can you explain what what is the problem of the scenario? Like you can.
So the underlying JSON document could be disposed, and in this case, the backing store would have been returned to the array pool. I think that's the issue that Jeremy is referring to.
Right. But you still have an element. It's still an element. It doesn't really know it shouldn't give you a span. Or you grab the span, you dispose a thing that looks vaguely unrelated, and now the span is invalidated.
That's
fair.
Pipelines works this way, but it's probably a more advanced API. But for comparison, and it's a Microsoft extension.
For the JSON reader, it's you gave it the memory, you own the memory, it's only allowed to look at it, and so it's just giving you back a span of your thing.
It is a restruct, absolutely. Yeah. So that kind of changes the calculus. Another thing with JsonElement, JSON document, is that it comes in two modes: the disposable variant and the non-disposable variant. I'm not sure what the Azure SDK's use case is, but maybe we could expose this conditionally on the non-disposing variant, in which case even returning a span would be safe. But I suspect that this could be diminishing the utility of this API.
Right. Is that if you have one that's backed by the array pool, the property will throw? Is that what you're suggesting?
Yeah, I mean, I'm cringing as I'm hearing you.
Well, you would need some sort of check, right? So now you need to know what type of JSON element you're looking at.
And to be fair, I think it's opaque at the moment. Like, you don't really know if a JSON element is disposable or not.
Right, because the answer is call clone if you need to save it, and internally it knows if it actually needed to clone itself or if it already was the safe clone.
Could we just can we invert this and say you can ask the document, passing in the JSON element, and say give me the value as a span, and then the document can, if it's disposed, it would throw. Otherwise, it would return you the span.
I mean,
I have a...
So,
Eric,
I have a question. What are the guarantees given by JSON element if the underlying JSON document is disposed? Like you you unsafely retrieve a nested JSON element from a JSON document that is disposable, and then you dispose the JSON document. What happens when you try to access that JSON element after the fact?
The properties on it at that time will then throw an object dispose exception. The problem is you save the span to a local, you do work, the span has now changed and is somebody else's span. And looking at your code, that may not be at all obvious that that just happened.
Yeah, I understand.
So
I still think that. Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. You can respond, and then I'll go.
I'm not responding. I still think that there is utility in this API. I've had need for it. I can see how people that understand how to use this might have need for it. Perhaps the answer then is we kind of make it verbose enough or hide it well enough so that people don't misuse it in the way that you're describing.
Yeah, so what I was going to say was that the way we've solved this in other places like list is we have a class that makes it obvious this is an unsafe operation. So collections marshal, for example. And then we have an API that is get this thing as a span. And
You cut out there at the end, Tanner, but I think we got the thrust of the point.
I think my question for Jeremy is, how is this different from any other API where you can request a span and then dispose the underlying thing that gave you the span?
How many of those can you think of?
Well, memory comes to mind, right? I mean, like if you have a managed memory and you basically dispose the underlying memory, then if you still have the span on the stack, I mean, now that shit is invalid, right?
Yeah, read-only sequence coming from like a pipe.
So
JSON reader.
that is true. And Levi's probably thinking right now, because I've heard him say it too many times, memory is actually the most dangerous type we have in .NET.
Well, that was Jan saying that, not me. I just happen to agree with it.
Fair enough. So the answer with memory is 99.9% of all memory objects are not backed by a disposable source. They're just an array or string. But otherwise, the things that have span properties are usually things that took the span in the constructor. So they're simply telling you data you already know, and you have the right access to the buffer. You can invalidate any of it at any time. On list, we moved it to collection marshal. I mean, here we could name the property dangerous value span. We could make it a JSON document dot dangerous get value span of JSON element. I mean, we can do things with naming, but it was very intentional on this type that we never give back the span because the lifetime, like we can't describe the lifetime.
Yep.
And our answer on span returning things has been, if you can't describe the lifetime, you can't return the span.
Maybe I'm naive, but like, given how spans work, like, wouldn't the method that disposes it, like, wouldn't have to be the dispose call would have to be either on a different thread, in which case many bets are off, or it has to be in the same method body as you're holding onto the local variable, right? So like at that point, the method is on the screen where you see the dispose, and then you're accessing the span, right?
But by the nature of JSON document and what it has evolved into with cloning, JSON document.dispose will either do nothing, or it will return an array to the array pool. And you don't know which it'll do.
And that could happen. Yeah, and that could happen like in a nested call, right?
So
like
the dispose,
it can't be async.
Yeah, and the dispose could be a no-op, and then your span still works, and it still has the same data in it. Or it could have returned something to the array pool, which then got re-rented and now has been overwritten.
Okay.
You just can't tell.
To paraphrase Groucho Marx, these are my API proposals, but if you don't like them, I have others. So I actually shared a link in chat for some APIs that were added in UTF-8 JSON Reader that require a bit more ceremony, but they avoid the problems that are being described here. And they also solve the escaping problem at the same time. So in .NET 7, I think it was, we added a bunch of copy string methods in the UTF-8 JSON Reader class, where you basically just specify a destination buffer and have the thing copy the data into the destination buffer while dealing with escaping as well. If we don't feel like exposing span or JsonElement or JSON property, that could be the alternative implementation here.
Yeah, because this is like most of what somebody would want to do with value span, we think is be equals, and that's why we added value text equals, or whatever we called the thing. That was so you could say, this is my destination text, or this is my thing I want to match against. Are you the same thing? And we didn't have to give you the span for that. We can add the copy. This reminds me, the other reason we didn't add the span is because JSON document, as long as we've held to it, it does not expose UTF-8 versus UTF-16 behind it. Exposing a span would do that. Having copy string that lets you copy it in UTF-8 or UTF-16 forms does not reveal the backing data. You just get to ask for it in the way that you wanted to look at it.
Yep. And I think we need another API in this case, because you did mention text equals. While there are overloads for text equals for read-only span and of byte and read-only span of char, there isn't an overload for comparing one JSON element with another JSON element that happens to be a string. So maybe perhaps in lieu of value span, because I actually used the value span to implement deep equality comparison, maybe we need a value equals element that accepts, a text equals overload that accepts JSON element on top of the existing overloads, so that you can do that without allocating.
What happens if the JSON element is backed by UTF-16 data, like with this API, since it's a byte? Like, do you get, sorry.
It's not supported.
Yeah, it's currently not supported.
Everything must be UTF-8.
Oh, okay, that's what I thought. But it's just like a hypothetical feature, or like everything gets converted to UTF-8? Like,
yeah, if you call the copy
I
string,
think one thing
it'll
that,
transcode. Tanner.
can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay. I think one thing that's worth noting is that I don't think the copy string case covers the scenario being asked for, specifically because span isn't just about removing allocations. Even more so than removing allocations, it's about removing the underlying copies of the data. And that's an often missed nuance, because the copying is almost certainly going to be more expensive than the allocation and subsequent GC handling ever would be. So if the consideration of this is for performance reasons, I don't think copy string covers that, especially for potentially large strings, where we're going to be ultimately paying more in cost to do that than to have any kind of API that handles the comparison or need more directly with it, while being able to avoid that copy. So I think providing the other APIs might be goodness, but there might still be an underlying need for something like this in an unsafe way, even at a later point in time, even if we expose those. And I think that's just worth calling out.
Maybe, but again, I was reminded by seeing the overloads of copy string, and yes, we could decide we haven't done it in 5 years or however long it's been, and that means we're never going to do it. But JSON document, the name UTF-8 is not in it at all. It was intentionally set up that if we added a UTF-16 based JSON reader, that it could work with that as well. It's not supposed to reveal the encoding behind it. and that means it's not supposed to return a span of bytes.
Yeah, and I totally agree with that.
I mean, realistically, I don't think we would ever add UTF-816 support to the type. Basically, the prior art is building a new DOM every time a new need arises.
Yeah, I'm not sure that's the prior art we want to commit to, though. I mean, I think I understand the comment about the encoding, but like, it does seem to me we are kind of like halfway pregnant already, in the sense that, you know, we call the underlying reader UTF-8 JSON reader, and our implementation pretty much in the entire thing kind of relies on us just sharing buffers. Like, maybe the API doesn't, but I think practically we can't change it easily anyway. So
yeah.
I think it would be fine as an unsafe API in the sense that, yeah, it's a guarantee we're giving. We just don't want to talk about it.
Yeah, the design, at least the initial design of JSON document, and therefore JSON element and JSON property, is we could add a new JSON document .parse of a UTF-16 based JSON reader, and everything just keeps working. Like, nothing else on these types exposes the encoding. Only the input.
We can still give you a span of bytes.
And we do have JSON. I think we have JSON document.parse that takes JSON text, so string, and as far as anyone can tell, that's UTF-16. The fact that we transcode it and do UTF-8 JSON reader is an implementation detail.
Sure. I mean, I think practically, if we were to do an unsafe API, we would just say, "Yep, sorry, you're calling this API. We give you back a span of byte." Still a span of byte, it's just different encoding because you called a different entry point.
Yeah, the name, like, if we are ever going to allow this, then it should be reflected in the name, absolutely, that this is a raw.
Yeah.
It's a raw span, basically. Anyone's guess what it actually could contain.
If we release this API and then change the underlying encoding, like, I can't imagine us ever doing that, right? Like, people will use this and that code will break.
No, I mean, the way it would work is you would have to call a different entry point, right? So, like, we would say that the current entry point is basically UTF-8, and then you have a different entry point that is UTF-16. Right? It's just that the API...
It doesn't matter. Like, JSON element is still an exchange type, right? Like, code will be written that works on JSON element, or like, right?
I think, but that's kind of the point of why, you know, I think we are saying it shouldn't be on JSON element. We would have an unsafe API to get it, because because then the statement is it's an unsafe API because you can only call this API if you understand the lifetime or other elements of your handling of the DOM. You can't just take in a random DOM from someone and call these APIs and have it work. And I think in cases like the Azure SDK, they control that. They own the lifetime, they own the storage. They could make those assumptions. It would just be part of the contract of calling this API. So I think we could make that work. It's just, you know, is it important? You know, does it unblock people? Are there other designs? And I think what we're saying is we haven't exposed it because so far the need hasn't been come up yet.
If we did it, we could do it. Levi and I were talking about it in chat a little bit. You could do it as a JSON Marshall try get UTF-8 span. And then if we ever added UTF-16 in the future, you could have try get UTF-16 as well. But that would allow the power users to do something like if try get UTF-8 span, else fall back to the slow copy path.
Yeah, that's true. You could do that too.
Yeah. Also, if you had a way of determining that the underlying data was in fact returned to the pool, then it could also return false.
Right, that's the problem, is I think by actually making it seem like you can handle like an arbitrary JSON element, because you know that like try get UTF-8 span will return false in a hypothetical future when we have a UTF-16 representation, like that's kind of sending the wrong message, right? Because you shouldn't be calling this API unless you created the element and you control its lifetime. and therefore you should know. And
The yeah. Interestingly, we wouldn't actually need to overload or we wouldn't need to vary the names because try get out to a UTF-8 based span of byte and try get out to a span of char. Um, like the it's virtually return type overloading, but it's not. So
right.
they could both be JSON Marshall dot try get value span and JSON Marshall try get name span, and then overload them in the future for UTF-16 with span of char.
Yeah. I mean, to Stefan's point, you could have the API work in such a way that you have to pass in the JSON document, right? In which case you can detect the case that it was disposed, right? It just means after you call the API, if you keep holding onto the span and then you dispose, well, then sorry, you just read garbage at that point.
I mean, I wasn't necessarily suggesting like that you have to hold a reference to the JSON document everywhere in the code that you use this API. I was just more saying like, if we're trying to like make it easier for people to like handle both UTF-8 and UTF-16, which might happen in the future, code and be like future-proof against that. I guess it's a good idea, but like you do have to make it really clear that you shouldn't be accepting arbitrary inputs.
I mean, if I were to make a choice between copy string and JSON Marshall, I would probably just go for only copy string, only because it solves the JSON escaping issue. The problem is that there is no routine as such that we have made public that handles the unescaping in the first place. So users are pretty much on their own if they're trying to achieve that. If the code ever encounters escape data, they're out of luck. And I think further to that point, the value span on UTF-8 JSON reader, that's a foot gun of its own, because we know that users have been relying on this without necessarily checking whether the value is escaped. And in that case, their unit tests would be passing, but in prod, they could be seeing all sorts of bugs happening.
Yeah, it almost seems like if you have a try API, you might make as well make that part of the try API, right?
As in never return escape data, only return data if it happens to be unescaped.
Yeah, basically say, yeah, try unescaped value span or something like that, right? Then you just return false if the data is escaped.
And for what it's worth, that's the pattern that the kind of non-allocating converters in system text JSON are following. Like they basically check if the underlying value is escaped, and if it is not, they just copy the span from value span, and if it is escaped, then they fall back to copy string, which does the copying to a buffer that they own.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so what do we want to do?
What I'm hearing is we want to have a try API. I think the thing we haven't decided on is where it would live. I assume it would live on some unsafe marshalling type based on what we discussed.
Yeah. System runtime interop services JSON Marshall. Which is where all of the other classes that do basically the same thing live today.
I mean, Tanner's right. It seems weird to have something in interop services here, but like that is the established pattern.
That, to go back to things Jan has said, it's interop services and marshal are both words that people should understand are the same as unsafe/dangerous. And so
Yeah.
putting it there is here be dragons.
I mean, I think we should still try to make the API not a foot gun, right? So I like the idea of saying it's a try pattern. The method exposes kind of like what the guarantees is that we preserve, and then we return false if we can't, right? So that if we, for example, support multiple encodings or the data is escaped, then people don't accidentally do something terrible.
So is that the plan, to only return it if it's unescaped, or rather if there is no escape characters or are no escape characters?
I think so, because I feel like if the value is, if you have to do some transcoding, you might as well call the other API that does that for you, right? I like the wordplay here.
So sorry, what does false represent in these APIs? Whether the underlying buffer has been freed?
No, it would basically be like the return value is, can I give you the span that is of the right encoding and is unescaped? If the answer is no, then no. Like why wasn't that? Well, you might not know, but that doesn't matter, right? You have to write the code for the else part.
If the underlying JSON document has been disposed, then exception would be an acceptable behavior, as happens with all the other JSONElement APIs.
I would
true.
say
Absolutely.
So, yeah.
Yeah. Now, so to be clear, since there is no UTF-16 internal representation, like, would we do the car overloads now? And if so, would they convert?
No.
No, I'm just
Okay,
showing
and
that. I'm just showing it from the future, and then we'll erase.
Yeah.
Okay. So it is weird to have like try false represent multiple things. I understand ultimately it's like whether or not we can give you the span, which sure.
Yeah.
But like right now it seems like there are two things that we're considering, right? It's whether or not there are escape characters. If there are, we return false. And two, in the future, whether or not this is like the underlying encoding.
Right.
I mean, honestly, I don't think that's terrible. I think the problem is the reason why we said you should not handle multiple, or why you shouldn't coalesce multiple error states into the return value is because if the code you have to write to deal with those errors differs, then, well, we did a disservice, right? But I think in this case, the else is the same. It's basically you have to use the other API to transcode the value, copy the value into a buffer, right? And that's what you would have to write in either way. If the encoding
So it
is
is different. So the difference is, no, so let me say what's different, is that the difference is that like you write code today, it will only return false if there are escape characters, and you can write logic based on that.
What if the
And
JSON
then-
element is not a string? If it's an object or an array or null, does it also return false in that case, or does it return the raw rendering of null, or the raw rendering of the entire array or object, including nested data?
What were you planning on doing with the property?
Yeah.
So the property would just return the raw UTF-8 encoding, whether it is escaped or not. But there would be some flag indicating that it is in fact escaped, which could be an out parameter here, or it could just be a property on JSON element and JSON property.
So you were originally planning on having this support more than just string, though, effectively? Like it was going to support, like...
So I initially what I had in mind was to only support string and number, but based on how JSON element is built internally, it could support kind of arbitrary JSON values, including like complex data, nested objects, that kind of stuff.
Right.
In which case you would just be getting the raw encoding of the particular view that you're zooming into.
In that world, returning false just because some string somewhere in there had an escape character seems like a little weird, right? Like if we're so focused on like the escape characters and strings, it should probably only work on string.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Like originally I was under the impression that it only works for strings. I mean, strings and numbers seems fine, but then I guess at that point I would probably do what Jeremy is doing right now. You basically just overload based on the type, and then you basically just say if it's not a string, you throw an exception because you called it on the wrong thing.
Yeah.
Right. So, I mean,
I
to
would be
take Stefan's
inclined.
concern, right? It's in net 9. So we basically reduced it now to it returns false if the string is escaped, which means that somebody somewhere in we think the correct action of false is to call copy string or text equals or whatever. They think, oh, I now know that I have an escaped string, and in the future the answer is, well, actually it's that you have UTF-16, so I can't give you the UTF-8 encoding. And and that is a concern, but I think that I personally would be okay with that.
Yeah, I mean, it seems weird to ask that question though, but yeah.
The
You know,
reason I'm
point...
mostly okay with it is like I don't think we're gonna add UTF-16 support, right? So like underlying, so like it's academic, really.
I mean, we can also mitigate the concern Jeremy raised by just exposing the value as escape property on JsonElement directly, because that seems like a fine thing to indicate if anybody cares. I mean, I don't know why you would care about the escaping unless you plan on using the value.
Right.
You know, I would say
So
that
maybe what we could have.
Go ahead.
I was going to say maybe what we could have is try get name span, try get string value span, and try and get number value span. Where try get string value span returns false for number types or if the encoding mismatches. Try get number gives you the raw number buffer, which should be the, I believe, 2's complement representation is what it's using. It basically it's the same thing you can use with iNumber.
The number is
big Indian and
the number's text. It's the stringified version of double.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, it's the string text.
String text.
Yeah, it's JSON. It's a text.
So
protocol.
it's still a string.
You know, at this point,
Well, JSON also has
Right.
non-string.
One thing that I don't like about this particular shape is that it isn't immediately evident what false means in the return value, and I'm sure we'll as this is being implemented, we'll find many ways in which to overload this false return value. At this point, I would just be so inclined to, you know, given that we've hidden this behind this namespace and behind this class, maybe the solution would just be to have a get row value that returns the read-only span of byte unconditionally, perhaps with an out parameter indicating whether the value contains escaping. Because I can see a scenario where people don't care about the JSON string being escaped because, you know, they don't want to do string comparison. They just want to get the raw data and write it somewhere else, perhaps. Who knows?
Okay, so
but what happens if you call it on an object and you include the braces, the colons, the white space, everything?
Yep, everything.
Huh.
Yeah, so if we add get, you know, JSON Marshall dot get raw value UTF-8 of JsonElement. So then, in the theoretical future where we ever add UTF-16 support, that then just throws?
I think it should just throw, yeah.
Okay.
And if we do ever add this particular flavor of JSON document and JSONElement, I'm sure there would be properties informing people what the underlying encoding is.
I think the issue with that is that will break people on roll forward in a way that we typically try to not break people, even for unsafe APIs we've exposed. And so I think the try pattern forces users to think, I need to handle a fallback here in case it does change in the future.
Yeah,
Um,
I agree with Tanner. We can't make an API that's contracted never to throw an exception suddenly start throwing an exception.
if I were to bet money on this, I would say that this would never happen. And I'm only saying this because UTF-8 JSON reader, you know, eh, the entire stack is built upon the assumption that everything is UTF-8, and changing JSON document to support other encodings would necessarily require us reworking the underlying stack to also support this. And given that everything is a ref struct, I find it very difficult for us to achieve that. Like at this point, it's not very easy for us to abstract away the fact that the current JSON reader implementation is hard baking UTF-8. Now, we did add the allow ref struct thing in the newer versions of C#, which would theoretically permit an iJSON reader interface that UTF-8 JSON reader could implement, and theoretically JSON document could target. But again, like it would be building effectively a new JSON serializer from scratch.
Right. But so
I
the idea
think
was
the
never.
consideration.
Go ahead, Tim. I yield.
I think the consideration is that there's a big difference between we're unlikely to ever make a change and we are guaranteeing we will never make that change. If we end up exposing get raw value UTF-8 not as a try API, we're effectively guaranteeing, in the same way that collections marshal get span for list has guaranteed we will never change it to, like, evenly chunked buffers that still allows near linear lookup and indexing. We have guaranteed forever that it is one contiguous buffer at the point we expose collections marshal. And in the same way, this will guarantee we only ever use UTF-8.
Sure. I mean, one possible alternative, if this ever happens, is, we just make the value transcode, make the method transcode to UTF-8, and that avoids breaking users in the way that's being described.
I don't think it would avoid breaking users because users expect it to have O of 1 complexity.
Yeah. And
that's
and you aren't really the raw value anymore because you're the synthetic value that you made up as part of transcoding. But the concern was never that we were going to make UTF-8 JSON reader support non-UTF-8. The concern of JSON document is at some point we would add a non-UTF-8 reader. Like when we wrote JSON document, people asked for the string parse because it's, well, if I already have my text in a system.string, why do I have to call encoding UTF-8 get bytes of the string? So the abstraction
I
supports the abstract concept of JSON. We currently only have one reader, and I think Newtonsoft only has one reader, which is UTF-16. Like,
no. So Newtonsoft abstracts the concept of a reader, so it could be just reading out of JToken.
Fair enough. So the thing behind JSON document, and again, so we wrote JSON document when we were starting in JSON land. We knew we only had time to do UTF-8. We were talking about UTF-16, and we haven't done it since, and maybe that means we're never going to. But JSON document's purpose, or part of its purpose, was to hide the encoding. And this is breaking that wall, and
so
this method
to
here can throw, right? It'll throw if the JSON element is exposed.
JSON document as an abstract data type. Is it effectively an immutable DOM representation? Is that the way I'm supposed to understand it?
Yes.
Okay.
Weren't we talking about this being in a world where like you can only safely use it if you own that JSON element? And in that world, like it's not switching from UTF-8 to like UTF-16 without you knowing. And like it's in JSON Marshall. Like, so I don't see why we need a try API. Like, yeah, it can throw. Like you would have had to have changed something. Like,
and a try API that literally can't return false, people are not going to handle the false.
Well, it's not just that, but like if we don't actually have any situations where an API might throw, then people, I guess this is an extension of what Jeremy just said, like people are going to get used to it not throwing.
Right. And
But you created the JSON element,
but
right?
there's no roll.
It won't throw.
The only roll forward that would break it, right? So this roll forward would break it. We added UTF-16 based reader. We changed JSON document.parse of string to use said reader. Then now you didn't change your calling code of JSON document, but now get raw value UTF-8 starts to throw because we changed the way we plumbed that method. Because
Yeah, I
the
think we don't get to
encoding
do that.
was hidden.
Well, more insidious. It's not that you call this get raw value. It's you call some NuGet package, you call a third-party library, and they call get raw value on your behalf.
Which they can't do because of memory safety, right? Like we just said, like that is something we are never going to say is okay in any circumstance.
Oh no, you can absolutely do it, right? Because if the idea is you're calling this other API, you're calling this library, and the contract is such that I, the caller, actually own the object, and the library is just a leaf utility method that never stores anything. Like it's totally fine for them to party on the object, right? Like
I mean,
there's
it's
nothing
fine to,
inherently dangerous about that.
but I think what we said is like, yeah, there's nothing in the type system that says you can't do that, but we would consider that, not good form, because basically the idea is similar to when you call, the span API that gives you, the span from a list of T. You kind of have to understand what other invariants are there, right? So like, you kind of have to preserve those invariants. I think what Jeremy just outlined would just be an invalid change for us. I mean, in my opinion, even if we make it a try API, the amount of code that will depend on the behavior to not have to deal with faults suddenly now has to deal with that. And I'm pretty sure that either regresses perf or does something else, which kind of defeats the point of the API. So I feel like if we want to expose this API, we probably have to say, if you give us something, we don't change how the internal representation is unless you call a different top-level API to get the different object back. Otherwise, like, how do you reason about your code?
Which would be pretty
Like,
weird if
thing
we
is,
added UTF-16
you know
JSON
this-
and we transcoded for JSON document.parse of string.
So I agree with you, but at the same time, I think we can all agree that it seems very fringy for us to do that in the first place. So I don't think it's a real problem that we have to contemplate.
Fair enough.
I think this whole regarding of JSON document as an abstract data type, it's problematic. Like suppose that at some point we added a read-only wrapper for JSON node, which, as you know, is mutable. So what if at some point we receive a JSON document implementation that wraps JSON node instances? What does getting the raw value from that mean in the first place? Like just by I guess entertaining this type of API, we are really hard baking the assumption that it's backed by some sort of encoding at least.
But I don't think, I mean, we are saying these things as if they're at odds. I think fundamentally, when you look about marshalling APIs, the whole point of those is usually to give you the underlying memory, which is, yeah, there is value in having abstract data types so that people that use the data types don't have to think about that. But as soon as you do any sort of optimization, the whole point is to unwind that and directly do something with the understanding that once you do that, you buy into whatever invariants you have to preserve, right? But similar to list of T, it's like, yeah, you don't really think about that it's baked by an array, but like it's baked by an array, like and so fundamentally that doesn't change, right? So I think that's the same here. We can probably say, yeah, there's some invariants that are there and you don't have to think about them, and these APIs will expose them to you so you have more efficient code. And I think it's reasonable to say if we really, really feel strongly about changing them, having them throw seems fine. Like that's just the way it is. Like, because I think we have to say we probably can't change what we do for existing API patterns, but at that point we would say, yep, there's a new set of APIs, and if you get the object from those, they have a different memory layout, so if you call those APIs, they will throw. But we can't do the thing where suddenly you upgrade and suddenly the implementation does something different and now it throws or returns false. I think try versus exception at that point is largely doesn't matter, because the point is that people haven't tested it and probably don't rely on it or can't rely on this new behavior reliably.
Yeah, I agree with that. And to your point, you can add the try method if and when we add a UTF-16 JSON reader, right? And then it suddenly matters and people can test it.
Yeah.
And
So, Eric, you mentioned JSON document wrapping JSON node. Isn't that actually a thing we did?
No, we just built a completely different DOM type.
Okay, I thought
we didn't
JSON node had a like two JSON element.
Yeah, but it's transcoding, so it's pretty expensive.
Okay, so we didn't enhance JSON element to understand it can be using the document lookup table or JSON node. We just said
No,
we'll copy the data. We'll export the JSON node to JSON and then parse it.
it happens in surprisingly many places in SDJ, and which is why I find Levi's comments in chat particularly pertinent.
Right. So I mean, so if we want to try API that has a way to return false, we just thinking out loud, we could take this already existing JSON node to JSON element. We can put a bit on the document that says you're not allowed to expose the underlying value, and then if you call that way to get a JSON element, then this try will fail because no, you don't get the raw value because you didn't give it to me. It's completely synthetic. You're not allowed to see what it is. Then we would have a place that try get raw value UTF-8 is already returning false, and then people would need to deal with it. Just because yeah, the problem with the try, if there's no way that it returns false, it's the same as not having a try. But if we invent a false case in this release, then that means that the answer was already there. You were just holding it wrong.
I do kind of agree with Emo though. Like it being an us problem versus a them problem is a little bit academic because like people will still get it wrong, and especially if we think it's likely that UTF-8 support is all there's ever going to be, having this try API that always returns true seems wrong to me. It's like it's very confusing, but I don't know.
Well, remember when the try API was proposed like half an hour or so ago, the reason that it would return true is not just to say it's in the correct encoding, but also the data is the data is what you expect. The data represents an unescaped name or whatever else was the invariant, right? But now we're saying that it would represent literally the raw bytes that were in the payload.
Yeah, well, I definitely don't like combining like multiple reasons the operation can fail into like a single bool. If it's one hypothetical reason in the future,
right,
fine. But I think it just depends on how likely that future is.
Right. Well, I mean, the true, basically it would be return true if you can reasonably do a switch on this value, and return false of you can't, including that I don't know what it is. Or at least that I'm going to pretend that I don't know what it is.
Is the proposal right now that it would literally just give you whatever raw bytes were in the stream, even including whatever white space happened to be there, whatever comments happened to be there? If it had trailing commas, they would also be there, and so on. We wouldn't do any fix-up.
For object,
No.
yes. Like a string or a number can't have comments or trailing, like because they're bounded by. They have a beginning and an
Right.
end that doesn't include any of that other stuff. But yeah.
No, we might as well decide that only string and number are appropriate value kinds that we want to make this API work with. But at the moment, I don't see any reason why we couldn't make it work for more complicated values.
Well, at that point, like, what guarantees are you making about the validity of the incoming data? Is the span that you get back like guaranteed to represent well-formed JSON?
It has already been parsed.
It's been parsed according to the rules of the parser, which might not be the rules of well-formed JSON.
Fair. It's been parsed by our parser.
So that means it's valid according to the rules of whatever
UTF-8 JSON
properties
reader.
were passed in. Okay.
I would see the primary users of this API, like especially if it could represent things like entire objects, being the people who are like serializing the JSON that they're deserializing to begin with, like internal communication, right? Where they can do some like optimizations based on like, well, our data always has no white space and whatever, and we'll fast pass this. You know what I mean? Like, and stopping people from doing that when it's easy enough for us to give them the raw bytes.
Yeah.
Doesn't
well, but,
like, I mean, this is a Marshall API, right? Like, give it to them. Like, why not?
But what this one of the things that I just brought up though is like, if one of the scenarios is taking this data and forwarding it somewhere, like you don't necessarily know that whoever you're forwarding it to will interpret it in the same fashion as you, because you haven't actually guaranteed to the caller that it is an actual honest to God like valid ECMA payload.
Sure, but this is a Marshall API, so hopefully you generated a valid ECMA payload in the process of getting here.
That's the same as saying, and maybe you think it's true, that just because you can call UTF-8 JSON reader, whatever notion we have of read to end on that one, which I think is just open the root object and call skip, that, hey, that didn't throw, so now I can pass my payload on to the back end as is. Like, okay, if they're in Python, then it may be a different reader. Like,
is this a capability that the JSON document exposes right now? Like, give me the raw bytes, even if those raw bytes have to be copied?
The JSON document has parse, and then it throws or doesn't. And now, if it could read to the end, then it gives you back a JSON document, and if it can't, then you get an exception.
So, for example, let's say that the incoming payload had trailing commas, comments, whatever, right? Would the JSON document, if I called the JSON document and told it like, please turn this back into a JSON string or JSON byte array or whatever, would those comments, trailing commas, whatever, still be there?
So if you gave it just bytes, those will be considered malformed. If you gave it to a reader that was told to allow that sort of nonsense, then I don't know what JSON serializer will do.
I'm checking because I don't know the answer to that question.
Yeah, because so here's the other part, right? Like we're ostensibly giving an API that says here is the same data that we looked at, and here, like, this is an equal representation to what I the JSON document believe to be correct. And now the thing is, like, if we're giving people two APIs, one which is give me the span and then like write it somewhere, and the other is given a JSON document, write it somewhere. If those actually produce different things on the wire, like, we need to figure out whether that's an acceptable behavior.
No, so I'm checking the code now. It is being sanitized, so comments, trailing commas would not be replicated if you're trying to serialize a JSON element or JSON document instance. It will recreate a fresh representation using a UTF-8 JSON writer.
So that is actually a difference in this value span API. If the value span returns an object, if the value span represents an object and the object has nonsense that JSON document would have discarded, then that nonsense would now be present and would be forwarded.
It's actually super useful. Yeah, but like, what if you want to write something that like keeps the comments and stuff? Like, well, it's a marshalling API.
But here's the thing, right? Like, it is a difference in behavior that I wonder if people would expect, right? That doesn't mean it's a bad thing. It just means that, like, oh, it's a consideration that needs to be documented.
Yeah, I mean, the comments, you would never see the comments in JSON document, so it writing them down is actually unintuitive, because it has said they didn't matter. It deleted the data. It never exposed it to you. It actually makes sense that JSON document, when serializing, is going to be creating it basically node for node, again with the writer, because it would need to match the white space settings you asked for in serializing.
Yep.
The raw value, if this exposes an object, it's going to show every aberrant new line. It's going to show every time you didn't add a new line. Like, it says, I started over here and I ended over there, and everything in between is this object. It's JSON. And that would include comments if the reader was in comments mode. And Yeah.
I think the term raw being used in the API should convey this.
Right.
Okay.
Yes. I would see raw as give me back the memory that went into this.
Yeah, so if people complain about indentation being busted, we can tell them that you were using a raw API.
Yeah.
And that's totally fine, right? But as long as people would have the legitimate expectation that it is literally whatever the raw data was, and JSON document has not done any type of fix-up to it.
Right. So the only failure that I see with this one, aside from, so we have JSON document wrapping synthetic memory models where there is no raw value to give back, and there's JSON document wrapping a UTF-16 based reader. Those are both potential future problems. One of them was a previously discussed, and like I know that we started writing the code, and that's why when Eric mentioned, I was like, wait, didn't we actually write that feature? But apparently we didn't. We wrote the function, but without that method of implementation. So, I mean, things change in the future. Like I think if we added support for UTF-16 to JSON document, we would just say breaking change, try, or that get raw value UTF-8 can throw now.
I mean, I put this in chat as well, but I don't think we'd ever do that for JSON document in isolation. We would have to do it for the serialization stack in general, which would require new converter types. It would require basically replicating system text JSON.
Sure, this is just the concern of a library that's published on NuGet that in 5 years starts failing when calling this function. They don't know why they're failing. They received a JSON element, and now it's throwing. Or they received a JSON document, and now it's throwing. It's they didn't control how it got created. They don't know what nonsense went on behind it. Just all of a sudden, this thing that used to never throw throws now. I mean, actually, it will always throw if the document is disposed. But
one possibility is that we make the decision today that JSON document is fixed to UTF-8, and if something gets added in the future, there's just an interface that we have JSON document implement.
I mean, yeah.
I get that it was designed to be abstracted away, but the reality of us having JSON JSON node, and all these competing DOM implementations probably means that we might actually have to build a shared interface that all these things implement.
Right, but JSON document is that interface.
No.
Yes.
It's a class.
Yeah.
No, JSON document.
Well, it's the abstraction.
If we say no to this, JSON document is that abstraction. It was designed to be that abstraction.
Right. Yeah.
But yeah, I think if we take the current JSON node to JSON element, or whatever shape we have for that is transcoding behind the scenes, and we make that produce a JSON document that says always return false from this guy, then I think we've already set ourselves up for enough future success. There are now JSON elements that if you pass to this, we will say no. And you need to deal with that.
Yep. Fair enough. I mean, it's an advanced API, so it doesn't matter if it isn't super ergonomic anyways. I would also add an out parameter indicating whether the value is escaped.
Is that something you actually already know upfront without needing to compute it again?
Yes.
Okay.
And that includes for like an entire object graph, like whether or not there are any escape values anywhere.
So the internal implementation currently has complex descendants property that basically identifies whether any of the containing nodes contain escaping. So I think it's reasonable to just expose that as is for more complex values. So for a complex document or a complex array, this would return true if any of the JSON strings or property names contain escaping.
What would you do with that, though?
But
You're talking about returning an object, right?
Complex is also true if you're an array of object.
Yeah.
Because complex means... The complex bit means you have to do work. It doesn't mean that a string is escaped. It just is... I can't do something simple like go to the memory table and say, like, go forward 6 elements. I have to think in order to dive deeper. So I don't know that you want to out has complex children.
That's wrong.
Yeah, like I don't know what the caller would do with that information.
Because for string, it makes sense, but if you're getting raw JSON, who cares if it's an object that itself contains an escape string? You're gonna have to interpret the JSON. Like,
Sure.
You shouldn't be sequence equaling 2 JSONs that came from the wire because white space. So.
So does that mean that we might want to constrain it back to numbers and strings?
Where you're gonna either return false or throw an invalid operation exception if it's the wrong value kind?
Yeah, because indicating to the caller that, like, if you're specifically caring about strings, and like 99% of use cases are about JSON strings, you want to provide them with a signal that, you know, what you're handling contains escaping. But if we think that this doesn't make sense for more complex values, maybe we should just have it throw for more complex values. I don't know.
I mean,
what's the behavior today of value equals? Value equals presumably only compares the value of a number or a string, or does it? Or can you pass in a whole JSON and have that make sense for an object graph?
Good question.
Like, I assume it only works for strings and numbers, right?
I think so.
Like, I'm okay with saying, you know, this API only makes sense when you look at a primitive, right? Doesn't work when you do it with, you know, complex objects.
It only works for null, string, and property name.
Null, string, and property name.
So, string and null, which could be a string, and property name, which is a string, but for this guy.
Arguably, that should have been number as well, only because numbers can be arbitrarily big. But yeah, I think it's fine if we extend that principle to JSON Marshall. Like, we reject null, we reject Boolean, we reject arrays, and we reject objects.
So,
because why would you care about the raw representation of an object, since you can just, you know, traverse it?
I mean, it's so cool though. Okay, but like, what if I want like a subsection of the object, but like I want to print it out and keep the comments and the trailing commas or whatever? Like, it's kind of neat. Like, can we make is complex an out variable and just define what that is? It's like, well, if it's a string, which you know because you have the JSON element, then it means it's escaped or not. If it's like a complex object, it can mean that it has an array of objects or whatever it means. Like, it means something, right? Just document it.
So I want to kind of call out what I wrote in chat and be like, what? First off, who is asking for this, and what scenario are they trying to enable? Because if we're saying that we're not going to allow try get raw value to return like objects and arrays, but the scenario was people want to be able to very easily forward those back out on the wire, like, then we haven't actually accomplished the thing that people want to do.
So this requirement was originally sent to us by Christoph Swalina. So like it's the Azure SDK folks that were looking for this. But I can share about my own use case. I had to do this internally, and The reason why I wanted this was to implement deep equality comparison. So I only really needed it for JSON strings in this case. So I wanted to get the underlying raw value when comparing two separate JSON elements that happen to be strings without allocating.
Right, but we already have the text equals helper.
Right, but the
I mean, maybe
right-hand
not on
side...
JsonElement. Or yeah, JsonElement has it.
Yeah.
It's called value equals.
Yeah, it does, but the right-hand side argument can be a read-only span of char and a read-only span of byte. It cannot be JSON element. So you would need to extract that read-only span of byte from the right-hand side JSON element.
Well, you would also need to do all of the decoding yourself.
Yes.
Which is kind of annoying, right? It would be presumably nice if you had a requirement to compare the names of two JSON elements, then in theory we should have an accelerator equals method which handles unescaping if needed. That way you didn't have to do it yourself.
Yeah, it's not in the proposal, but I think exposing, exactly, such an overload for both JSON element and presumably for JSON property as well, that would solve at least my use case. I'm not sure what Azure SDK's use case might be.
Right. Well, if Azure SDK's use case is that they want to be able to take a node, regardless of whatever complex data that it might represent, and just immediately copy that back out somewhere, right? Like, us saying this only works for string and int, like, probably doesn't actually solve their problem.
Possibly, yeah.
So who did we actually make this API for?
I can't answer that question. Like, this is, I came into this proposal kind of just assuming we'd approve this.
Sure.
For every value kind.
So, but here's this is what I'm having trouble wrapping my mind around, though, right? Like the API that we're kind of circling around doesn't solve either Azure SDK scenarios or your scenario. Like, it's, as far as I can tell, it's an API that we're proposing that has no customers.
It does solve my scenario, absolutely, because
well, assuming you're willing to do a bunch of other work along with it.
Yeah, so there is a corner case where if both left-hand side and right-hand side happen to both be escaped, then yes, you kind of fall down to a slow path where you need to allocate for one of them. But generally speaking, it does solve my use case.
I mean, but you still have to write that fallback, though, right?
Yeah.
Which
versus these two things have now solved the name or the problem that you had.
My specific use case, yeah.
Right.
But I think it would be incorrect to assume that this is the only use case.
Oh, right. It's just it seems like we're having trouble articulating whether having an API that works only for strings or integers, numbers, would actually solve our partners' use cases.
Yeah, that's absolutely the case. But that being said, I think the only use case I can think of where, getting the raw encoding for complex values is what Stefan articulated earlier. Basically, people needing the comments and trailing commas to be, copied over verbatim.
Yeah, and I get that. I don't necessarily like what Jeremy wrote on the screen, even though it is a good, probably a good.
Sorry, the Jason Marshall stuff or the two equals methods?
Like presumably if we really wanted the ability to compare to strings, and we would have an API which takes two ROS chars or ROS bytes or whatever that says, like, these may or may not represent escaped JSON strings. Just compare them for equality using a JSON unescaper. That way you don't have to pass in a JSON element or a JSON property. You would still need a way to get the raw data, but whatever.
Right. I mean, yeah, if what we wanted to know is are two UTF-8 blocks the same string under JSON rules, that sounds like static JSON encoded text equals left and right. I mean,
yeah.
Like it's what's the problem we're trying to solve and do it. The thing that I expect that somebody really wants to do with this span, especially if they want it as a property, is they want to write switch JSON property dot namespan case when it's this word do this, etc. And that is entirely wrong because the name could have been escaped. I mean, maybe it'll help be a reasonable accelerator in some other things. And yes, it'll let you write the optimized switch statements, but it requires giving away the encoding and giving away the data, and this is just not what JSON document's supposed to do. And they can write their own DOM. It's not hard. I know, because I did it.
Yeah, it wasn't hard, right?
Asan did some pretty clever things with the memory packing on the thing. They can copy it. They can make their own. Like, we don't need to solve every problem for everybody, but the problems we solve, we should solve well. And I personally don't hear good use for this. I do hear good use for this.
Yeah. One concern I have with JsonElement.value equals specifically is, should callers assume that this has deep equality semantics?
It'll throw if the JSON kind's not string.
Okay.
Because it's just an overload of the of the other things.
Also, the other overloads have the same behavior, right?
The other overloads take string, span of char, and span of byte, and they throw if the destination type is not null, they throw if it's not null and if it's not string. Property name is also in there because the same underlying helper deals with name equals. So, we can.
Yeah, I mean,
we can call it,
my...
string element, right? Like, boom! I only work for JSON string.
Yeah, I'm satisfied by that.
And so this would allow null and null, and it would return false if one's null and the other's not, and then it would throw if either of them is not, then a string.
I mean, I guess the only comment I would have is on line 10, I would probably call that string value equals or something.
Well, value equals is the name of the method that exists. So this would just be overloading it.
I see. Because I guess I would assume that it would be able to take any primitive, not just string.
And we could decide we are introducing a new name for it, but Eric's described thing is he wants an overload of this method that works on a JSON element.
Okay.
For what it's worth, I have another proposal coming up that implements deep equality as well. So keep in mind that this is coming as well.
Sure.
But I mean, I can understand the notion that it's complicated.
Yeah.
And that therefore we want a different name, but logically it's just overload being another overload for what we have as string, UTF-8 string, and string span.
I think the fact that this only works with string is implied by the type of the right-hand side. That's not the case for this new overload. But by naming it string element, I guess you kind of somewhat avoid that problem.
Yeah. And it's part of a method group that only works with strings, so I guess that's okay.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
I lost my buffer. There we go.
Someone actually brought up a really good point in YouTube chat, which is if you have two ROSs and you want to compare them for equality, you need to scan them again to see if they're escaped, whereas the JSON element object itself already knows if they're escaped. So it can do an easy bypass if needed.
I mean, you can write the thing with a tell me where they first differ, and then now ask, is this an escaping differential? Like, they can write the logic forward. They don't need to normalize the strings. They can just ask, do they mean the same thing?
If you know ahead of time that they're already unescaped, then you can do a length check up front, which makes it much more optimal.
Yep. And I'm like, there are reasons that you'd want to use the more local ones, but I'm saying if we have the abstract problem, it sounded like someone somewhere suggested the abstract problem of I want to know if two JSON strings are equal and I have them both as, read-only span a byte. And it's like, okay, we can add that somewhere.
Yeah, we could. You're absolutely right. I had posited that just as a generic solution to the problem that Eric had, but what you have on the screen works fine too. I retract my my complaints.
Okay.
It would be interesting though to go back to the Azure SDK team and be like, what exactly do you need from us? Because if we're just returning a span that is like, here is the number or here's the string, like, is that useful for their scenarios?
Well, I mean, I actually sat in a meeting with them maybe a couple of years ago, and I think, of course, it's been a while, but I think the main complaint is we can't actually look at JSON strings without allocating a string. And they basically wanted us to give them the exact same API that exists in UTF-8 JSON Reader. But I can try. Values escaped and value span. So just returning the read-only span of byte as a property on the type.
Right, but
which is something that we're not doing in this case.
UTF-8 JSON Reader is about reading and interpreting JSON. JSON document and JsonElement is about talking about the concept of JSON in the abstract.
Yeah. And UTF-8 JSON Reader is a ref struct that doesn't actually own the underlying buffer.
Right.
So I wonder if the problem is that the Azure SDK team is actually using the wrong API for the job they want to do.
Because JSON property, when we designed it, we decided it would have a system.string for name, and when you first call it, it allocates it, and that's the, what we decided of, like, if you're switching on something, you want the unescaped thing, and the only thing you could switch on at the time was system.string, because the pattern matching of spans didn't exist yet, and so that's what we came up with. We could add another property, which is UTF-8 name, or name UTF-8, and then if we ever add UTF-16 support, that'll be the allocating one. But yeah, I think I don't hear a good reason to expose the raw value at this time.
Yeah, what I think I'm hearing is that we're killing JSON Marshall for now until we get more requirements from the Azure SDK team, and we're keeping value equals and name equals. Should we also do copy string? Because copy string, I think, is useful regardless.
Sure.
What is that method?
That's a similar design was added in UTF-8 JSON Reader. It basically just copies either UTF-8 or UTF-8 to a destination span.
Got it.
How do you know how big of a
big? Yeah.
Well, that's the thing. In UTF-8 JSON Reader, you have value span, and therefore you have kind of an upper bound. I don't think you have that in JsonElement. So maybe we need a try copy string, or we need to expose the length.
Doesn't JsonElement have isn't the string already allocated ahead of time in JsonElement?
It is.
JsonElement will have the raw string. Yeah. So if it's so this is the complex children bit. If it is a JsonElement kind of string and that string has escaping in it, then it says I am a string but I have complex children, and then when you ask questions of it, it does things.
You can always get an upper bound on how long the buffer needs to be. It should be relatively easy for JsonElement to give you that answer.
I believe it's not being exposed at the moment,
right,
so this information would need to become available.
Because JSON, like, here's JSON property. It has fewer things on it, so we can talk about it. But the name. So if we wanted copy name or /try copy name, nowhere here does it tell you how long the name is.
What is the type of name right now?
String.
I mean,
when you call it an
name.length. Oh, okay, so it materializes on demand.
Yeah.
I see.
And then it puts that in a cache that lives on the JSON document somewhere that is like, hey, I've pre-allocated JSON property number 175. Here's its answer.
So I'm going to throw a wild idea out there, which is a separate ref struct type, which is like JSON name or something like that, or JSON string contents, where that ref struct, it's kind of like a string in Swift, where it doesn't actually tell you what the encoding is until you explicitly look at it. It's kind of like a Heisen thing, where you can query it and you can say, like, you are an abstraction, but I want you to tell me how large a buffer I need to allocate if I were to try getting the UTF-8 representation of you, or the UTF-16 representation, or whatever. That allows you to change stuff under the covers.
The problem with the length is you need to pick an encoding or have a different length per encoding.
Yeah, it would be per encoding.
Yeah. So you'd have length UTF-16 and length UTF-8.
That is exactly how Swift works.
Well, Swift has like get length, and then you have to pass it an encoding option.
Yeah,
they have an enum, but
right. It doesn't actually have like a length property. It has you have to tell it, like, this is the particular representation that I want. Now give me the length.
Right.
So we could do the same thing. We could say, like, this thing returns like an abstraction of a JSON string. We don't actually know what it is under the covers. Or you, caller, don't actually know what it is under the covers because you should not care. But if you want us to give it to you in form A or form B or form C, let us know and we will do it for you.
So presumably that abstraction would be giving you its length in UTF-8, in UTF-16, etc.
Depending on how you call its get length method, yes.
Yeah, I don't know that we really want to add it right now, but what I've heard is...
But it's other language. This is how other languages have solved this problem. Is really what I'm getting at.
I don't know why it's solving the problem, though. It just seems like we could just have those concepts on top of the JSON element, and that has the same problems. You're just pushing it down one more level.
If this thing is appearing in
a dedicated data type.
Yeah, if the same problem exists in 12 places, then one type means that we don't have to double up everywhere. But yeah, I think it exists in 2.
But if we were to make a UTF-16 DOM, it would exist in 3 places.
Sure. I don't know. I feel like we are over-engineering at this point.
Oh, we are. I'm just saying this is how you would. This is one way to solve it.
Like it sort of look like this.
Except for instead of length UTF-8, length UTF-16 would be something like max length or whatever.
Yeah.
Because you want it to be O of 1.
Yes. Is this telling you the decoded length or the...
At which point, I don't think you really need a try method.
Right.
I mean...
Yeah.
On that, now you get the good old... Some people think tries are better. Some people think pre-checking links is better. Some people think operation status is better. Like, they're...
Well, if I can give you in O of 1 time what the worst case scenario is, then you can just give me a buffer of that length. I'll fill it as best I can, and then I'll tell you what I wrote to it.
Yeah, but it's if you're in the middle of... If you're a complex try-copy operation yourself or try-write operation yourself, sometimes it's just like, I'm just going to call some other try, and if it returns false, I'm returning false, and I don't care why. You need to give me a bigger buffer because he said I needed a bigger buffer. Don't make me go read another property. So it could have both.
Sure.
But anyway, I don't think we're actually saying we want to try inventing this type and solving this problem right now.
No, it was just an example of other art in other languages.
Right. So then, now we have do we want to try solving the copy string problem for JSON property when you currently can't know, or you currently don't know how long the name is?
Yeah, I don't think that would be particularly helpful.
So I think the copy string needs more thought, and since this was supposed to be a 5-minute issue that we've now spent 2 hours on, I don't think we have the time to think about it.
Yeah, let me speak to the Azure SDK folks, and maybe I can come back with some amended JSON Marshall proposal, because I kind of liked the crux of this idea.
But yeah, so are we saying no to this issue, or are we saying let's add these equals methods for this issue?
I'm pretty sure people won't be satisfied by this, even if it solves my particular use case. I mean, I don't have a use case because I can just add these APIs internally, so
Sure.
I don't care.
Right. So I'm asking, are we more infoing this? Are we approving with a completely independent shape, or are we closing it?
Let's needs work it for now. If you still have it, could you also record the shape of the JSON Marshall type for posterity?
Let's see if I can hit undo enough times to get it back.
While Jeremy is typing this up, what is the reason why we need the new Guid format? Is it just because it's a
There is
thing?
no new Guid format.
Well,
it's not a new format.
Okay, but like, let me rephrase this then. Why do we need to add support for this format?
It's not a format we're adding support for anything like that. There is a particular way to construct a GUID, which is used heavily in scenarios, including first-party customer scenarios that we've been asked to expose. Today we have one way of creating a GUID implicitly from pre-initialized random data, and that's the v4. And the proposal is there's a new way to also create it that's based off of Unix epoch timestamps that would be desirable as well for both first party use and for general broader community use.
Yeah, I read the issue a few days ago. One question that I have is like, why is the response so negative? Is it just the naming? Do we think it's just people don't like that we have GUID already?
No,
and they would
so
prefer UUD, or
so we actually discussed this topic a couple months back when some of the user community had come up. There is a subgroup of the community that believes that there needs to be a new type called UUID because they feel strongly that UUID and GUID are different concepts, even though the UUID spec explicitly says in the first sentence, also known as globally unique identifiers, and elaborates on that in depth throughout the spec. So, and then there's a further subset of that are frustrated that apparently SQL client handles GUID in a particular way today. Effectively, our own implementation of GUID is compliant, it is deterministic, it is well-formed and well-behaved, and SQL client, potentially for historical reasons, effectively implicitly inverts some of the bits when they're storing it, and so they do not consistently store the data and use it in their comparisons, and that leads to issues with SQL client in particular. And there's users that are particularly frustrated about that and are trying to say that this is a horrible API and it is badly designed because a downstream external consumer to .NET is potentially doing something incorrectly, or maybe doing something that's specific to their domain. But it doesn't have anything to do with what we're exposing.
Well, it's not just a hypothetical.
Like, consumes it correctly.
So the Steelman argument is that like the SQL client, or at least for some drivers, right, that you can, when they accept a GUID today, if you use it as like an index, right, that like lookups actually are faster because of like ordering or something, right? And then if these clients get a GUID that's generated using these new APIs, then access times based on this index end up going up. Like it's not completely hypothetical.
Yeah, but that has to do with the downstream client is consuming GUID incorrectly.
Yeah. All right. 2 interruptions. For one, Teams has made a change, so chats are now showing up on the YouTube live stream. So be aware of that. Number 2, can we close off this issue before we continue discussions on other issues?
Sure.
Yep. Yeah, what you posted looks like a proper representation of the JSON margin we discussed.
Okay.
Yep.
But I happen to notice that I'm getting chat bubbles appearing at the top of the window, which used to not be the case. So thank you, Teams, for once again adding features nobody wants.
Well, I'm not sure that's nobody, but surely somebody asked for it. But yeah, so the discussion we have in chat, so like intuitively, I think it makes sense to have an API that is logically related to new GUID, because new GUID is the thing that generates the GUID, right? And so like we're saying there's a different format, so it kind of makes sense that that's expressed as the naming, but it seems like Levi doesn't like that, and I don't quite follow why.
So Levi's statement there was Go ahead.
I was going to say, people right now use guid.newguid as a way to generate 122 bits or whatever it is of strong entropy. In fact, we even made the guarantee a few years ago that NewGuid will generate strong entropy for you. And now we would be introducing a method with a very similar name, literally only 2 characters difference, that you probably wouldn't even notice in review, that basically introduces like effectively 0 entropy at all. My concern is that people will use NewGuid v7. Well, it's a timestamp though. Like the timestamp's predictable.
48 bits is a timestamp.
Oh yeah,
the
okay.
remaining
So 60,
12 plus 62 bits is purely random.
Well, is it purely random, or are we going to like seed it with a counter, or what?
So the default by RFC spec, the default handling is that the additional 12 plus 62 bits is purely random. There is a variant of it in which users can provide explicit additional information which is not covered within the confines of what's proposed here, where the user can explicitly specify additional seed information instead of the random data. So our API here would still be using 74 bits of random data, and in the future we could expose additional overloads that allow the user to provide that data themselves, for example, if they wanted to do sub-millisecond timestamping or seeded counters instead.
We do already have that API. It's called guid.parse.
Yeah. But Tanner has a valid
That's
reason
incredibly slow.
We already have the notion of you can build the data either from the flat parameters or guid.parse. You can build a v7 GUID. I'm just saying that there's already the notion that just because you receive a GUID doesn't mean it's a GUID, or doesn't mean it's CSPRNG. But I think Levi's thing is, and I've written this code, which is I need a random string. We've now added random string generation APIs to solve this problem, but I needed a random string, and it needed to have entropy, so it was guid.newguid.toString in. And it's like, cool.
And now we would be saying that we're removing 60 bits of entropy. Like we're basically having the entropy, which, like, I get why the scenario exists, but I'm afraid that people are going to call this API when they intended to call the higher entropy API, and as a result, they're going to introduce problems into their own code. So my only hang-up is on the name. That's all.
Well, so
yeah. Okay, one question I have is, like, you mentioned earlier
NewGuid is a terrible name anyways.
True.
Yeah, that's fair. Just the name that we shipped. But like the existing NewGuid, is that logically then v6? Because earlier you mentioned V4, and it seems like
It's
V4
V4.
is what's.
No.
So what
it's
is
V4?
Yeah, what is V5 and V6 then? We don't have that. We don't need it. We don't want it.
So this kind of got out of order because we started discussing it before I got to give the whole spiel. The basics here is that there's an RFC for Guid. It defines many different versions and has historically there's V1 through V8, where V8 is reserved for purely custom user data. V4 is what we expose today, and that's 122 bits of random data plus the remaining 6 bits are used for the variant and version information. For V1, V2, V3, V5, and V6, there are potential reasons to expose them in the future. There's also much larger and broader discussions that need to be had around them if we were to expose them, because V1, for example, is somewhat deprecated at this point, and it was mainly intended to include network card MAC address as part of the identifier. V2 is specifically related to security. V3 is an MD5 hash. V5 is a SHA-1 hash. So all of those are kind of like, there's questionable security semantics and deprecation around them. That means they may not be appropriate to ever expose. V6 is basically a replacement for V1 that doesn't include the legacy MAC information, but many people don't use it today. If we were to expose it, it would also be a separate discussion. The immediate need is then just for V7, which was ratified a couple months ago, and it's been in discussion for several years. And it specifically uses a Unix epoch-based timestamp. It's very straightforward in how it gets initialized and handled. Like I said,
the
we've got some
expectation is
first-party
we're adding it because it was
customers that are asking
recently.
for it.
Yeah, it was recently added, and we need it for interop, presumably.
Yeah, interop convenience. There's first-party customers that have been asking for it. I had initially just put this as community-based, and then Steven tagged me and was asking if there's any progress on it because he had some first parties that were asking about it.
Gotcha.
Which led me to drive this forward faster.
Gotcha.
If we don't like the name New Guid because the connotations around Guid, I would say that we should just expose it as maybe Create instead, which would have been the kind of more natural name for this anyways. Create V7, and I don't know if we want capital V or lowercase v. I don't have a preference there.
I think the answer is we don't want a V in it at all.
Yeah, normally we write out the word version for stuff like this.
But I don't think we want... So chat has even pointed out, without listening to this discussion, version 7, that sounds like the highest version. Higher must be better. I should automatically pick it. And so I don't think we want to have the API name say it's version 7. Say what it's doing. And then, so new GUID from timestamp. Or whatever. Or new GUID from timestamp version 7.
Which overall more confusing to...
Right, then don't ship it.
But it has
yeah, but we need this
we don't.
API. And
we don't. We do not need this API. Literally anyone can write it. They can write the GUID, they can do the memory layout, and then they can call new GUID that takes the parts. Anyone can write this. We don't need to.
That applies to every API we've ever shipped.
Yes. I'm saying you can't say we
API
need to add
shipped.
this.
That's not a reason to not ship an API.
You said need. We don't need to add this. We can hit closed and move on with our lives, and that will not end the world. That will not end .NET.
I mean, it's good that we're recording this because we can take that 5-second rant and just play it over every single API review.
Right.
Exactly.
Need does not apply. Customers have asked for this.
True. It's a little reductive. You could reject any API on that ground.
Customers have asked for this. Now the question is adding this better or worse for .NET? Given the comment from the chat that they'll see this V7 and be like, well, this is the one with a version in it. It must be newer. Newer must be better. Otherwise, why would they add it? And it's not better. It's different. Some people think it's better. Some people think it's not better.
3, Jeremy?
Because it's newer. It's not better. It's newer.
Is it so? Based on what Tanner said, is it fair to say that calling those versions in numbers is kind of misleading. It's really just different formats of the same memory, right? And sometimes you want to use X over Y, and it doesn't really mean that X and Y have some version relationship.
Right. This is the order they got added to the I'm a way to construct this 128-bit value list.
Right.
5 was after 4. It doesn't mean it was better than 4. It was just somebody came up with a new algorithm.
Yeah.
The actual spec, however, refers to it as version 7, and that's where what people who are familiar with the spec go and look for first.
Yeah. Well, that's fair. I mean, the other question I have is, like, based on the description here, it seems like some of them would have to take additional data, right? So, like, the v3 format, for example, would require you presumably to pass in a namespace ID and a name that they can hash over, right? Is that fair, or do they all have a parameterless
Yep.
thing as well, logically?
Right. So v3 takes a namespace and name. You could theoretically randomly seed it, but the intent of that API is to take in a namespace name, concatenate them after converting to a canonical sequence, typically UTF-8, and then computing an MD5 hash over it.
Yeah, I think so. New GUID version 7 might be fine if we get rid of the parameterless version. Somebody can pass UTC now if they want. We don't need the convenience.
Yeah, that's kind of where I was heading, because if we basically,
even though that's going to be the majority case.
Yeah, don't care. It's this one is the time-based one versus new GUID, which is the random-based one. New GUID can take no data because it's supposed to fill it with random.
But both of them include random data.
This one also includes time. And by not having the parameterless overload, we're telling you that this includes a timestamp.
I mean, I'm fine with saying there's new GUID v7 now and new GUID v7 that just takes the timestamp. That's also fine by me. But it would kind of like imply that it's named differently. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I'm ambivalent on the V prefix versus typing it out. That one I care less about. I kind of agree with the naming issues that it's a bit weird, right? If you look at GUID right now, you say GUID dot and you see new GUID and then you see new GUID v7. I think practically speaking, we know from usability studies that people prefer the shorter name, right? But the problem is it does kind of look like there's a newer thing, and that seems better, right? That's kind of how everything else works. And that seems unfortunate. I think the question is, can we come up with a name? I mean, you could call it new GUID with timestamp or something, right? But then I think Tanner has a point, which is the people that need this or the people that want this, they know of the spec, so they know of the name v7. So like, I think there's some sort of need for putting it somewhere. I mean, we could call it new GUID or, you know, GUID dot with timestamp v7 or something, and maybe that's the way to do it. I'm not sure that create versus new is really helping, because that seems like that's just confusing it.
And create puts it higher in the IntelliSense ordering.
Yeah. That's kind of why I was asking what happens with the other versions, because if we end up in a world where we have all of them, well, at that point, having some sort of naming scheme makes sense that is consistent. If we only ever expose this one thing, then I think we might as well name it and then put v7 at the end or something.
GUID factory.
Well, I wasn't suggesting that, but like I think having new
explicitly-
GUID as a prefix makes reasonable sense, I think.
Could we explicitly have it be create and then have one called create random to make it very explicit that there is an overload that creates a random GUID for when users want a random GUID?
Where create random's
The problem
just
is
a perfect
that already
alias for new
exists,
GUID.
right? Yeah, you basically fight 20 plus years of expectations, right?
I
it.
wasn't
Well,
entirely.
it's more just trying to solve the issue of ambiguity.
Yeah, I wasn't being facetious when I said Guid factory, because you could imagine that if we did have an actual dedicated factory type or Guid.factory or whatever, you could say like create version 4, create version 7, and all of the create methods would take whatever parameters are appropriate for that version. Create version 3 or 5 if people want them.
No, we could do that. I mean, we could in fact just say new GUID v4 is an alias for new GUID, right? I think the problem is just if you see all of them next to each other, I think the original argument still holds, right? V7 is higher than V4, so
but that's why I said put it on a type like Guid factory instead of just Guid.
But how is that any different? It's just saying Guid factory dot create GUID v4 versus create GUID v7 is still higher.
Because it's not on the type that 99% of our customers use. It's on the type that people need to look for in order to get the behavior that they're seeking.
Right, which also hurts discoverability and just looks absolutely terrible when you're trying to access the API as compared to just, GUID.create or GUID.new.
I mean, hurting discover, I wouldn't say it hurts discoverability, right? Like, I think what we're ending up here is a world where, like, less than 1% of our audience needs the API that's being discussed here, where the vast majority of our audience needs the original API. Like, that calculus tells me it's okay to move this newer API to a place that's maybe one level of indirection removed, as long as it's not terribly undiscoverable.
Yes, I think Levi's intentionally being
the vast majority. I know a lot of our existing Windows customers.
Most people who want to GUID just want to GUID.
As it applies to more general databases, and I'm not sure I'd agree with that statement.
That's not where I see it in practice. So granted, both Jeremy and I are coming from places where people are looking for effectively secure random data. Like that is the type of code that we are exposed to on a day-to-day basis. So that is coloring our perception slightly.
Yeah, so there's the security people, which is a concern. Most people would be happy with a V1 GUID, which means most people would be happy with a V7 GUID. They don't care. They just want a GUID. And the fact that somebody is caring and saying they want a V7 is like, well, you're not the user. All that you care about is that you have a number that nobody created before. And the V4 does that. GUID.new GUID does that.
So that's certainly the case. That's certainly the case for a lot of developers that are using things in a security aspect. But there's also a very large set of users outside of that security aspect, whether it applies to COM or whether it applies to database usage or a lot of other usages where the explicit use and intent is to have timestamp-based GUIDs. And often where you can increment those within a given timestamp, which is why there's the alternate one, which has the sub-millisecond and the seeded counter version, and why this spec has formally been finalized, why we have 4 different timestamp-based versions in the spec, and why as soon as it came out, we had first-party users asking for it and pushing for it, and we've had community asking for it for about 2 years now. Like, I definitely understand there's a security aspect that uses random, but there is a huge aspect that you're not considering that very explicitly uses this. And it is not a minority or a small subset of the ecosystem, especially on Linux.
No, I get that. I think that most people would be happy with V1 if they understood the notion that it tells what computer they used. Like, Office GUIDs and COM, they're not timestamps. They're a number someone generated once, and then they increment a field in the middle, and then they all end with OFF1CE because someone thought that was cute. Like, Office GUIDs we've claimed the bottom bits of this GUID as a namespace. That's how they do COM. The COM just cares you're a number nobody else has generated. I can understand there are things that want ordering, which is caring about which bits are the timestamp bits, but most things that want a GUID that I've ever seen simply say you need to be a number that no one else has made up. And these are 7 different algorithms for coming up with that.
So then going back to my proposal, like what if we just call it new v7 or new version 7? So we avoid the word new GUID, leave new GUID as the thing that you just described, which is, it is the random thing. It's, good enough cryptographically, but it's also the thing that everybody wants, which is just, it's a number that nobody has. And if you want something more specific, then you call the new XXX APIs that are more specific. So we could have new v4 as well if we really wanted to, or new v6 or new v7. And then, they may or may not take arguments depending on the spec. And then that's basically what you do.
Yeah. My big concern is about the parameterless overload. If we take that away, then people who want the well-ordered timestamp-based thing, they pass datetime now or datetime UTC now. I'm aware UTC is going to be more correct, and there'll be mistakes, but it makes it clear that this, whether it's new GUID v7 or new version 7 or create version 7 or whatever, that this is a different notion of creating a GUID. It uses a timestamp. And so I think always having a formal parameter in it helps clarify that purpose. That's my biggest concern is the parameterless overload. Get rid of that, and my caring goes to almost zero.
Even if you name it differently.
Yeah, because if you name it something with a version,
so
somebody's going to look up the UUID spec and see version 7 is newer than anything else, and they're going to go, "Oh, that must be the new one. It's newer. Newer is always better." It's not. See Windows 11, but.
So we see the same thing, by the way, with SHA-3. Like when people wanted us to introduce SHA-3 because they're like 3 is better than 2. Obviously, we need this, and it's like no, stop doing. Like, don't do that. Stop that. Anyway, go ahead, Tanner.
So why not explicitly have create version 7 that has timestamp, and create random, so that users who want random explicitly see there's one called create random. That is the clear overload. It also removes the potential ambiguity that already exists with new GUID of what the hell does it do?
I mean, it'd be weird that we call
it with that proposal.
Create random and create version 7 because random is version 4. Like create random you could be like, is it going to pick a version at random? I'm just saying it's weird if one of them's named for purpose and the other one's named for version. That's just what's striking me as weird. If we're picking 2 patterns at the same time.
That's why I think if we go down the version path, I think we should have a different prefix probably than new GUID. I would just leave new GUID as you don't care enough to read the spec, but you get a GUID that's good enough, so that's the one you're getting. And I think for those people, like, I think given how old new GUID is, how overwhelming the documentation for this is when you search for how to create GUIDs in .NET, I think that's probably fine. So if we pick another prefix that is not new GUID, it probably resolves a lot of these problems.
What's the objection to just doing the datetime overload? Is it like a performance issue?
No, it's just ease of use, right? If I understand Tanner correctly, people that use it in database design, they just want ordering. So the TimeSpan, the timestamp based one does that for them. They don't actually care about the datetime, right? So they just want to get like the order in which they create these GUIDs to be ordered. And so in that sense, yeah, you always have to pass in datetime.utc now. Again, all you need is one asshole to not do that, and then all of a sudden it's no longer ordered in the way. But if everybody like has to do that, then you really want the parameterless constructor for that, right?
And the reason for calling it create random wasn't to deviate from create v4. It specifically called out that this is random data. And theoretically, we could even say that create random just creates random data and it's currently v4, but we are not tied down to an implementation of it being v4 variant 1.
Yeah, I posted in chat already. I don't have complaints with that.
So what's the actual proposal? I assume all these are intended as being new,
So the actual
and that these aren't existing. I didn't look them
yeah,
up.
so the actual proposal is we have the right. Yeah. We have the well-defined empty GUID today. We don't have the corresponding spec-defined max. I didn't know if max value or all bit set was better. Here we've used all three depending on scenarios. The formal name for it is max. Then there's the two well-defined properties that exist on all GUIDs, a variant and version. They just read the raw bits that correspond to that and return it. And then there's the creation APIs, which it sounds like we don't want to use the name new GUID. We do want to use a different name. My proposal then is just create, because that's the, and then spell out version. And then my preference would be to correspondingly expose a create random, just to avoid the ambiguity of higher version means better or not. It makes it very clear, I want random data, this is the one that gives me random data.
And it would be an alias for a new GUID. Like, it would be like the create random.
But we wouldn't necessarily be tied to that implementation unless we wanted to guarantee that forever.
All right. So then we get the question of, I think that the version 7 always having formal parameters gives it the amount of deterrence, or gives it an amount of deterrence that makes me happy.
I think in like high performance code, I mean, as weird as it is, even though it's going to happen internally, like people are kind of trained not to call like datetime.now super frequently. It used to be a lot slower. And I wonder if that's going to cause them to get like repeated GWTs, especially if we don't do the counter thing, since that's not required. And I don't think we're planning to do that initially anyway. But either way, it's bad. Like, to like reuse timestamps over like any operation that takes any appreciable amount of time.
Yeah, I'd personally prefer having an overload that we can default to just passing in date time UTC now to solve the ambiguity, to solve the potential issues that people are going to get with date time. But I don't think we'd want to block on that, and we can maybe bring it back for discussion later with user feedback.
I would say, like, if we're gonna do the date time thing anyway, I mean, why not call it new GWT v7? But yeah, it's okay. I think this is good too, and we can add the other overload.
Because at some point I'm going to lose, and we're going to add the overload that calls UTC now for you.
Yeah, pretty much. Like, I do think people are gonna like not want to have to explicitly pass in that parameter.
I would hesitate to take datetime instead of datetime offset, just because I think it's probably a good idea for us to drive datetime usage down, like, across the libraries. Also, because people are going to pass datetime.now, which is just like, they shouldn't be doing that.
That too, yeah.
Mind you, they can still do that.
Time.
What was
Right,
that?
because they can still do it because datetime is convertible to datetime offset, so
It's less likely. And all I was gonna say is, like, you know, daytime's useful for, like, you know, calendar meetings in the future and stuff for the you know, dates, you know, the offset might change, but yeah.
We're talking about literally a timestamp, right? Like,
Exactly.
I think Tanner said that's what the spec even calls it.
Yeah, I agree.
So daytime offset, like, yeah.
Yep.
that's kind of why I think having the parameterless version is nice, because, you know, then you don't fuck it up, right?
Yeah, a parameterless version is fine by me as well, or make it nullable. I don't have a preference between the two.
I think nullable would also be okay to me, except for the people that don't understand that they don't have to pass anything in. But yeah.
Well, I mean, that would be nullable with a defaulted value, or we could just say nullable, and if you write the word default, then you get datetime offset.now.
Right. Yeah. I mean,
we would
I
want the default value. Yeah, at that point.
Yeah.
Do we have like a strong preference between like default values versus overloads for APIs like these?
I mean, in this case, it might be beneficial to have the defaulted one just to make it clear that it's always timestamp based.
That's fair.
It's just that we pick one for you if you don't specify one.
Yeah,
You were saying, Tanner?
Yeah,
you broke
general
up.
consideration though is that users. Oh, the general consideration though is that user studies have shown people don't understand optional parameters for one, and the other is that it's less efficient, and so it's going to make creating every GUID slightly more expensive here.
But I don't think efficiency is a huge problem though, right? Because like we could do whatever inlining is needed, for instance, to special case people passing in the constant null, right?
Well, it's more like
nullable's a special type, and it does not get handled well.
It just means
that sounds like a JIT problem.
You'd have datetime offset DTO equal timestamp dot get value or default datetime offset UTC now. Right. And then the JIT will do things.
It's not just a JIT problem; it's an ABI problem.
Right. You got to like put the null on.
The shape of a nullable struct is inefficient itself.
Fair enough.
Yeah. I mean, personally, like I don't, as I said, like I don't mind having an overload that takes no arguments. It seems like I think the important thing for us is we don't want the common case on the call side having to pass in an argument, right? So in that sense, there's multiple ways to do that. I think, I don't know, like based on some of the comments, it does seem people use GUID generation in hot paths. And so it seems like unfortunate to pick an ABI shape that makes that harder. And given how much you think of GUID as a primitive, I would prefer more efficient encoding as well. And again, we should base the naming off of the idea that there is a parameterless version at some point anyway. So we might as well do it now and then just make sure that we are happy with the naming.
Yeah. So chat gave we need to look up how many P's are in the word timestamped, but they gave a suggestion of naming it both the purpose and the version.
I'd be okay with that. Slightly longer, but that just means I want the parameterless version for sure at this point.
I think that's going to. Yeah, I think that's going to make it harder to discover, and it's potentially it adds complexity into the concept here, which is that we're creating a version 7 GUID, which happens to include a timestamp and by default random data, and in the future we may decide to expose an overload that allows passing in the that we want to track sub-millisecond timestamping, or that we may want to provide a seed counter that the user provides. So we might have another overload that takes in 1 to 2 additional parameters.
We would just be classifying the GUIDs as this is timestamped, this is timestamped, this is timestamped, this is hashed. So this would be create hashed version 3, create hashed version 5. This is create timestamped 6, create timestamped 1, and I don't know what this one is. But so it would be create, and then the basis,
and if we end up
and then
having
the
a new
version
one in
number
the
if we
future
have
that's
overloads.
a mix.
Then it'd be create mutt version 9. Yes, I know we won't actually use the word mutt, but we'd come up with what's the kind of GUID you're hoping to create. I mean, if we don't like timestamped, we can call it ordered, right? Of hey, there's something in here that's going to guarantee it's ordered, and that's the timestamp. But I do think just the version makes
the issue is that the timestamp alone doesn't guarantee it's ordered.
Of 2 people with the same timestamp,
right?
but it's the same.
until you do the.
If you pretend computers have
Well, not
monotonic
just
time, then
two people of the same.
then two things
It's
generated
the same
after each other.
millisecond,
Yeah.
right? It's the same millisecond. It might
Well,
conflict.
Well, then your computer's just too fast.
Yeah.
Or it might not be properly ordered.
If you have the same
conflict.
millisecond.
If you have a proper 3 hertz CPU,
Yeah.
then
Like the whole reason for.
right. I'm just saying
The whole reason the additional fields are there and they default to random, but
Right.
don't require it.
I'm just saying it goes better with we have create random and then create, and it's create Y, and then the reason we have to put version 7 in it is because there are 3 different things that are this same pattern, and that people have said they apparently care. Now, if nobody else likes it and we just want create version 7, but I think that having the purpose in there does take away some of the I should pick 7 because it's bigger than 4. It's just a different thing. But I agree.
That's why I opted for the expose create random, because that removes the ambiguity of version means bigger, because you're basically gonna have, I think, 2 people. One is the one that only wants that they just want a random GUID. That's all they care about. They don't care about version or the spec or the RFC. Create random is very clear and obvious. That's what they want. And then there's the people that actually care about the spec, and so they're going to go and see create version 7. They're going to know they want a version 7, and that's going to give them what they need.
So removing the timestamped infix is what you're advocating, right, Tanner?
Right, just call it create version 7, match the spec, and give the split between people who only want random and people who care about the spec.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Emo's comment. Like, we generally don't do aliases, especially on the same type. So, I mean, I understand why we're saying we should add create random. To me, it feels like a wart.
Yeah,
I would be okay with leaving
I
that
think
off
new
for now.
GUID itself is a little bit of a wart, and it was
Sure, but there's warts we've shipped and warts we're adding.
Well, I think this is more, it's fixing the wart, and it gives a clear intent for future, and then the wart is new GUID that kind of exists there for back compat purposes.
Yeah. Emo's departing message was, whoa, you pushed buttons.
I mean, if we're gonna consider timestamp, we could go away from the create name and go away from the alias and do like new timestamp.
Yeah.
Guid v7.
Emo suggested instead of create from, and
that doesn't make sense.
Yeah, not a huge fan of from.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because things are still being materialized out of thin air.
Mm-hmm.
Because there's entropy.
Right, and it would be from the timestamp, if anything, not from version 7.
I could be convinced to leave off create random. Like, it's the create version 7 naming, like, solves the problem that I had coming into this whole discussion. So I'm grudgingly happy.
I mean, it means that you don't decide between new GUID and new GUID v7, and new GUID v7 is clearly better, just because it's, you had to add the suffix to make that new thing. It is different. Create version 7, if you have just the dumb version of IntelliSense, right? So you're not doing the AI, which one do I think you want? Like, it's just going to be alphabetical, so create version 7 is going to show up higher. But it does mean that, there is enough in the name that is a little bit of like, I don't know, do I want a version 7? And then the other one's like new GUID, and you're like, all right, I've seen that word before.
Yeah,
So-
because of that, that's why I don't think people are going to get tripped up all that much here. Because if, like you said, even if you're coming to this fresh, like having version 7 in the API name will kind of trigger something, I hope.
Also, like, yeah, I think UID version 7 isn't the most esoteric thing, right? It's quickly becoming one of the more common types of Guid UIDs you see.
Okay, now the thing that we...
Yeah, the whole reason I had proposed the create random was
Go ahead.
the whole reason I had proposed the create random was because Levi had raised the concerns, and because even though you've got new versus create as the difference here, there's, especially with non-English speakers and others, there's potential for confusion there as to why we've got both new and create. And the more standard pattern across the whole of the BCL has been to use create as the name for APIs when you can't use a constructor. So the create random was there to explicitly, to make it very clear, here's creation of a GUID. Here it is creating it using random data. You don't have to potentially be confused. Well, I thought new GUID was going to create an empty GUID, because that's what new GUID spelled out would do in every single language. It removes all of the confusion and fixes kind of the wart that's already there, putting us in a better place to move forward, because we've already said we can't really version new GUID because there's crypto concerns. So if we're having to create a new name to move forward, then let's reset the baseline there with a stable platform of, we have two ways to create GUID here. Random, which happens to be v4, but we don't want to use v4 specifically because we know people will be confused. And then create version for all of the other non-random datas that take some form of non-random seed.
So Tanner, I think this is where you take yes as an answer. If it ends up being a problem and we do find the aliases better, like we can add create random later.
Yeah, I'm not saying that I want it to exist or not to exist. I'm just saying that I think the proposal where you have a different method group as opposed to something that looks like an overload of an existing method group, like I think you have solved the problem that I think is going to trip people up in practice.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that it's a good long-term answer. And if we were
won't
designing
push back
GUID,
against it being approved, I was just
if we were designing GUID fresh, I agree we would not go with the names new GUID and create version 7. But new GUID, aliasing new GUID, I think is just going to cause more pain than it saves. But we do need to name line 11. Max implies they're orderable. Is GUID comparable?
Yeah. The formal spec name is Max there.
Sure, I don't care. Is GUID comparable?
Believe so.
Cool.
If it's comparable, then Max is reasonable, and if it's not, it
so.
isn't.
It is comparable, yeah. Comparable, comparable, whatever.
Yeah, I've said both in the same sentence.
It is.
So. GUIDs are comparable by implementing comparable.
The only weird thing there is that the 0.
Yeah. You would expect a min. If
the only weird
max.
thing there is that the 0/min value is called empty.
Mm-hmm.
And it will work for v7 GUIDs,
And so
right?
all but said
like,
is kind of the name we've given elsewhere to indicate.
Yeah.
And I assume that iEquatable will be like iComparable will be updated. So like given a v7 GUID, it does the right comparisons or something, or does it need to be updated?
There's no updating required. It's already correct.
Okay. Perfect.
A v7 and a v4 will compare however they compare, and two v7s will be well ordered if the timestamps were well ordered. Assuming that I remember that it's right after the 48 bit first field here that is where the version marker goes. But right, so the three names proposed are max, max value, and all bit set. All bit set certainly says what it does.
Is it exactly right? Because you still have the version bits that aren't set.
Yeah, and that's what we used in generic math.
Sorry,
So
I
all
mean,
bit set
what-
is explicitly all bit set. So the formal RFC max value is all bit set.
right, so it's version whatever the maximum number you can get out of 6 bits is.
Oh, okay. I didn't know that. So it won't be a V7 GUID or anything, which of course it wouldn't be.
Well,
Yeah.
right. So all bit set is uint 128 max value bit cast to a GUID.
Got it.
Right.
All right, that sounds fine. And that's what it is?
Which will then have a
Yeah.
It
It's
will
just the
have a way
RFC
that version
formally
gets
calls it
interpreted.
max and nil.
Yeah. The version will have an answer for that, which is a number.
Right.
But it won't be 7. So I think if somebody wants the GUID with all bit set, I think all bit set's a good number. Again, max suggests to me that you should be comparing them, that you should start with like GUID equal GUID.max, and then like now take the min of the two GUIDs, and it, like, so I'm just having trouble with the notion of a max GUID. It is the biggest GUID, but I think I prefer all bit set personally.
Why is max more important than min or all bit set?
I prefer it as well, and I just proposed
zeros.
We have empty already.
Oh, okay. Empty is all right. Thank you.
Which is an accelerator for new GUID, it turns out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The thing that people write when they want to call new GUID.
Yeah.
I see. And this will be a property, whereas empty is a field, because if we had done it again, we would have made it a property first time.
All right. So Tanner, I think you said you prefer all bit set.
Yeah.
Okay. Can we get a third so that'll
Yeah.
Sure.
be majority vote?
That's what we've
All right.
used
Sure.
elsewhere, and I had only proposed max because that's what the spec calls it, but the spec also calls empty nil, and that's also a terrible name.
So if you want the opposite of empty, the obvious answer is
And
would not
honestly, what they call version probably should have been variant.
Would we make this a read-only field for consistency with empty?
Why?
I was curious. I mean, I don't know. Because like that's what we did for empty. I mean, it's just weird that it's different.
I mean, our guidance is basically don't add public fields, and then if we were for some reason trying to align GUID with generic math, which would probably give me a stroke, the generic math doesn't allow fields. So
Okay. But then we'd have to come up with a new empty too. But yeah.
All of the places where we expose static read-only fields like int pointer.0 and others are places where we should have made them properties. They should never have been static read-only fields. We could have implemented them behind the scenes as a static read-only field, but it should have been a private implementation detail.
Sure. It's more flexible in the future when we want to change what it means. No, I'm just kidding. We're going to run logic every time it's accessed.
all right, we discussed adding a create random at the general. Did I capture all 50 minutes of our 5-minute discussion?
I think so.
Yeah, I'm not sure why we started this with only 5 minutes to go.
I don't either. I think Emo was just trying to get it closed, and instead we solved it. So
Solved. And now we have a Jeremy soundboard where he says no new APIs ever.
said no APIs are necessary. Or almost no API is necessary, though there are cases, and like when we get to whenever I finish the PQC work, that somewhere that's going to be because the company signed a contract that said we will add them. So that one we have to. This one we don't have to because there's no contract yet.
Yet.
I mean, unless a court compels action. No, I'm just kidding.
Turns out when you make a contract with the government, they then send the courts to enforce said contract. So,
I'll make sure to invite Brad Smith to next week's meeting.
yeah. All right. With that, I'm beat and it's lunchtime.
All right.
Ciao.
See ya.
All right. Well, thanks, chat, for some good, lively chat. I think everything did get addressed. One thing somebody asked, what do variant and version mean? They mean whatever they mean in the spec, which is interpreting a 2-bit field and a 6-bit field. Yeah, we're not defining them. The spec did, and yeah. So we'll see you. I think we have a meeting on Thursday. I'll look at that instead of going to lunch because I don't know, I care or something. Yep. So we should have a meeting on Thursday at 10 a.m. Redmond time if people show up, unlike last week. Yeah, so we'll see you hopefully Thursday, same .NET time, same .NET channel. Happy lunch or whatever mealtime or nap time it is where you are, and Auf Wiedersehen.